Did one of the greatest writers of history use his art to battle a tyrannical emperor in his own time? Author and scholar Claire Asquith explores that possibility in her latest book, Shakespeare and the Resistance. Later, Wall Street Journal book critic and author of The Enchanted Hour, MEGHAN COX GURDON, will tell us how reading aloud helps build deeper bonds with our families. And finally, we'll get story-ended with New York Times best-selling author Markus Zusak. The World Over begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. Claire Asquith, MEGHAN COX GURDON, and Markus Zusak are all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send us a tweet. We're at Raymond Arroyo. Now, I want to get right to it. William Shakespeare is regarded as the greatest playwright of all times. His plays and poems have deeply influenced cultures all over the world. My next guest is a noted Shakespeare scholar. Her 2005 book, Shadow Play, examined the religious and political messages encoded in the bard's body of work. Well, in her latest book, Shakespeare and the Resistance, she focuses on two mostly ignored Shakespeare poems, poems which the bard may have used to address the religious and political upheaval in England at the time. Here's my exclusive interview with Claire Asquith. What I loved about reading this, it debunked the myth of Elizabeth's reign, which we have a long tail on. And the narrative is she was this wonderful queen. She was a tolerant queen. That doesn't seem to be the case.
Less and less so as her reign continued. And the tyranny, which is what people began to call it at the end, was operated not by the Queen directly, but by her very, very expert Privy Council and advisors, and particularly William Cecil Lord Burleigh, who the more you read Shakespeare and his contemporaries, Spenser, the more you realize they saw him as the demon. So yes, he operated under the glamorous guise of Elizabeth, a tighter and tighter police state, and I think that's what scholars recognize now.
A police state. Yeah. No. Well, you see the Tower of London, and I mean,
yes,
it was a pretty cruel place, and you can't get past the scrawlings. I've seen them myself on the wall, the etchings on the wall, Jesuit insignia, prayers, crosses, all sorts of very Catholic references, which tell us something further. How does the Catholic dimension fit in to not only the story of Elizabethan England, but more particularly into the life and background of William Shakespeare?
Henry VIII is where it began, and you can see Shakespeare taking that deep breath with his second narrative poem. He tries to go back, how did we get into this situation? How did it all start? And it started, of course, when Henry VIII took over the Church of England in England and said he, the king, was head of the church. And in order to do that, he had to construct a synthetic religion, not Lutheran, because Luther laughed at the idea of a monarch being head of the church, and not Catholic, because of course the Pope would not accept a monarch being head of the church. So this was thought of at the time as a third religion. And as time went on, with its daughter particularly, in order to establish loyalty to this new church, an oath was established, the oath of supremacy, whereby everybody who wanted any sort of public job of any kind had to swear allegiance to the monarch as head of the church. Now, Catholics couldn't do that in good conscience. Reformers couldn't do that in good conscience. So you begin to have a perjured country. Everybody secretly practicing or believing something which openly they didn't say.
Right.
Now, Catholics were a much bigger number than historians up to now have recognized. When Queen Elizabeth's successor came to the throne, he, James I, had to say, I am going to give toleration to Catholics. And that shows what a huge, important, silent, dangerous, possibly majority they were. As for Shakespeare's family, like if you look at any family at that time, they were enmeshed deeply in this conflict. His father had up for recusancy, that is, not attending the state church.
Right.
Nobody really knows why. Could have been for debt.
But he was penalized.
He was penalized. He had to pay. And that's £20 a month you had to pay for not attending the state church, which was the equivalent of a year's salary for a grammar school teacher.
Wow.
So you just couldn't do it. You know, you had to be a hero. I mean, there were particularly Catholics, as we know, who were heroes at this time. But most people, Raymond, I don't know about you, but certainly me, we would have caved in and paid lip service to this increasingly tight regime.
Yeah.
But Shakespeare had a tragic case in his own family, and a typical one. John Somerville, his cousin, lost it completely. He was restricted as a young man, and he galloped to London with a gun saying, I'm going to kill the Queen. And the result of that was not only he died in the Tower, but the head of Shakespeare's mother's family, Edward Arden, yes, he was executed.
While you mentioned Shakespeare's family and his upbringing, I want to show people, several years ago, you and I went to Stratford-on-Avon, and we talked about the training of this boy from this little hamlet far from London, and how that training, though it seems parochial, really set the stage for the entire world to look in, not only on this history of England at the time, but into the hearts of humanity. Take a look at this.
They were called grammar schools not for nothing. They really did learn grammar, rhetoric, how to use language. Later on, he clearly had the run of a great man's library, and a lot more of his later education could have come from that. He could have gone to university, I think. But what's very interesting about Stratford Grammar School is that the teachers were chosen and paid for by the guild which Shakespeare's father eventually became chief of, became bailiff. The 6 teachers who were there covering Shakespeare's period, out of those 6, 4 had clear Catholic sympathies at a time when the government was cracking down on this. One of Shakespeare's teachers, Simon Hunt, taught Shakespeare when he was 9. 2 years later, he went off to Dowie and he became a Jesuit priest. And so it shows one thing that people have realized, that Shakespeare was educated in the humanist way, that is to see allegory and depth and many layers of meaning in texts. What the government and what the Puritans wanted was literal reading.
And what I love about this new book is it really is not only the history of this period, but it tells us something that we're still living through all over the world. But the focus here are 2 neglected poems, Adonis and Venus, or Venus and Adonis, and The Rape of Lucretia. And I have to say, as an actor and as a reader, I avoided these like the plague because I couldn't make heads or tails of them. What did we miss? Why are they so unreadable and largely neglected?
Well, because they're so boring. It's an extraordinary feat on Shakespeare's part, because they're both about a violent sexual assault on one on a boy by a woman much stronger than him, and one on a woman, and yet somehow, although, you know, we start both of them with a tremendous beginning that makes you, both opening verses are fantastic, and then digression after digression. And it's rather like those neoclassical Renaissance tapestries where there's all sorts of decoration all around the tapestry, but the main subject has got lost. Yes.
Totally lost.
Yes.
And in this case, your contention is it's because he's writing about something other. He's using the allegory to tell a different tale and embed it in a hidden way.
Yeah, exactly. And curiously, at the time he was writing these, a lot of his contemporaries were doing the same thing, and the same theme is there at the heart of all these narrative poems. And they have the same subject. It's an assault by a monarch on a subject. So they're all about the abuse of power. So Shakespeare, both these poems are about a king. Actually, in the story, it's not a king, but Shakespeare changed it so he is a king. A king abusing a woman, and a queen. Actually, in the story, she's not a queen, she's a goddess, but Shakespeare changes it to a queen. So it shows that Shakespeare's genius, and he does it better than anyone else, is to take his source, strip it down, and rebuild it with material that relates not to the neoclassical or the mythical source, but to his own time.
Contemporary reality. I want to show people this. This is Venus and Adonis. This is the opening of the poem, and I'll read this, and I want your reaction to it. Tell us what we're missing here. From the besieged Ardea, all is in post, borne by the trustless wings of false desire. Lust-breathed Tarquin leaves the Roman host, and to Colatium bears the lightness fire, which in pale embers hid lurks to aspire and girdle with embracing flames the waist of Collantine's fair love, Lucretia the chaste.
Now that is the opening verse of The Rape of Lucrece. It's just one sentence, and it's very hard to read because it's one great sweep, and what you've got there is Tarquin driven by lust. He's been told about this beautiful woman by her husband, and he can't wait. He leaves the battlefield, gallops off to find her, and sure enough, his lust is inflamed, and he rapes her that very night. Now, the funny thing about that verse is that people wouldn't have been expecting that, because that's not the original story. And it's a story everybody knew. And it should have begun with the soldiers laying bets on their wives. And they all bet, mine's the most beautiful and chaste, mine is the most chaste. And they all go back and they find, yes, that Lucrece is. But why does Shakespeare start like this? That Lucrece's husband has boasted about her beauty. And after this magnificent verse, the action stops. And Shakespeare, the narrator, says, now how could it be, why did her husband light the fire that triggered this giant catastrophe? Because in the poem what happens is much more than a mere rape of a woman. Society disintegrates. Whose fault was it? And he thinks it was the husband's. Now the curious thing about this is that all accounts of the Reformation from today, going right back to Shakespeare's day, begin not with Henry VIII falling for Anne Boleyn, but begin with Cardinal Wolsey, the prince of the church, byword for ostentation, liquidizing a few small monasteries just to get some petty cash to build his own vanity project, which are Ipswich and Christchurch. So that alerted Henry, through Thomas Cromwell, to a brilliant way of making a ton of money. But not just Henry. Behind Henry were a small group of very highly placed, very canny men, and they were the ones who drove the dissolution. So in this...
so Wolsey is the husband bragging about the beauty of the wife, and the wife, Lucretia, is the church.
She's not a person. All the critics say she has no personality. The beginning, she's the embodiment of utter sacramental beauty and treasure. She represents huge wealth, untouchable, but absolutely massive.
Yeah, well, and there's that moment where Tarquin, who is identified as a king in this poem, and he's not in the originals.
He's just a prince.
He's just a prince. Here he's the king, and he sets his foot upon the light at one point. Before he rapes her.
And actually that is a detail that works on both levels, because it's dramatic, like Othello, and when he writes Othello, he is definitely thinking of this moment. Sets his foot upon the light, but that is the moment he extinguishes the light, and the lights go out in England at that point. That is a moment where you accept it on a literal level, and and initiated readers who'd looked at the beginning and thought, Tarquin leaving the Roman host. Now that sounds like Henry breaking with Rome, and laying waste what is it? It's encircles within flaming
Right.
flames,
Flames,
encircling flames.
Right. Encircling flames, the waste of Collantine's fair love, Lucretia the chaste.
So waste, Shakespeare always parodies on, puns on if he can. It's the waste of England, if you like, the waste which people saw all around them still, with the ruins of the dissolved monasteries. So yes, every detail of these poems, they are on a surface level beautiful in that they're rhetorically and linguistically very highly wrought. But we see them, Hazlitt called them cold as ice houses. But once you see the underlying text, they are incandescent. Yes, he is absolutely burning as he writes these poems, particularly Rape of Lucrece, although Venus and Adonis are the more exciting poem.
Right, well, Venus and Adonis also, you have the powerful older woman who wants this younger, untouched, chaste boy in this case, and she uses her power and he dies.
Yes.
He dies. Now, not by her hand, but incidentally, yes, by her hand.
By her, she in fact, he dies because he's off on a boar hunt, this boy. And this again, people would have thought, well, now why is Shakespeare changing the source? Because instead of Venus falling for Adonis, who is very flattered and reciprocates, and he's a young man, in this poem is a very young man. He says, he's a boy. He says, I'm a minor, actually. This is a sexual assault on a minor.
Wow.
And Venus lifts him off his horse, tucks him under her arm, throws him onto the ground, and makes love to him. And the rest of the poem is Adonis trying to get away. It takes a whole day. And in the course of this, there is this long monologue by Venus as she tries to persuade Adonis to reciprocate, which she doesn't. And then she has to let him go in the evening. He goes off to kill the boar, to hunt the boar, and the boar kills him. And she discovers this, and this is the oddest moment in the poem. She identifies with the boar. She says, the boar kissed him with his tusks, as I kissed him. I am the boar, and the boar is me. And it's a very odd moment where she laments and accepts, as Queen Elizabeth did lament and accept her treatment of Mary Queen of Scots and Catholics in general. She had to look as if she was in sympathy. But an interesting point about the poem is that the Earl of Essex, called her Venus in his correspondence with King James.
I didn't know that.
That is, yes, King James was Victor and the Queen was Venus. And there's a point in the poem, I mean, Shakespeare has such fun playing with it, getting as far as he can.
Yes, he walks right up to the edge.
Right up to the edge.
I'm going to read this one little portion. I want your reaction to this. It says, call it not love, for love to heaven is fled, since sweating lust on earth usurped his name, under whose simple semblance he hath fed upon fresh beauty, blotting it with blame, which the hot tyrant stains and soon bereaves, as caterpillars do the tender leaves.
And what's interesting there is the tyrant becomes caterpillars. It's not actually the queen who is the tyrant, it's the caterpillars. And caterpillars was the word Essex used for the queen's advisors.
Wow.
And Shakespeare uses it too for bad advisors overweening courtiers in Richard II. So it meant parasites. But, and the distinction between love has vanished, true love has gone to heaven, and now what we have is this pretend love, which is lust. And in the poem just after this, he talks about lust as false and love as true. And that was a number of his contemporaries made the same distinction, and love represented the true religion, represented what was there in England, a big amorphous church before Henry. And then the fake, the fake version that came in after him.
Before I let you go, there is a dedication before both of these poems. They were both dedicated to the Earl of Southampton. Now, throughout time, many have suggested these were tokens of affection that Shakespeare was bestowing on Southampton. Why does he dedicate these two very peculiar poems to Southampton, who was a kind of effete, foppish figure, or is remembered as such?
He's remembered as such, and that is part of the rewriting of a very different history, which circles around the Earl of Essex. Essex was Southampton's closest friend. He admired him. He was 10 years older than Southampton.
And mounted a rebellion against
mounted
Elizabeth.
a rebellion, and his number two, his lieutenant in the rebellion, was the Earl of Southampton. So Shakespeare was actually dedicating this poem about what you do in order to resist tyranny. He was dedicating it to a man who went to the Tower for resisting tyranny. Now, the rewriting of history, the acceptance of Southampton as the fop that he made out he was, I think in order to take protective colouring in his early years, was done retrospectively by Robert Cecil and Company, the group who benefited from Essex's downfall. Yeah, so very tough on Southampton, because in fact he married happily, had 4 children. He became a very distinguished statesman under King James. He fitted out some of the Virginia Company ships, and the Hamptons are named after Southampton.
Southampton, yeah.
So he was a very serious guy, a man of action, by no means the fop that he posed as, like Hamlet, at a time when it was a good idea to look as if you were not a serious person under Elizabeth.
But it really does. It tells such a fascinating history, and the ripples through our own time. As I read this, and your fleet description of that world, that police state that Shakespeare lived in and was opposed to using his art, I kept thinking of the Chinese in China today.
Well, exactly. I mean, Andrew...
The faithful Chinese.
Indeed, the faithful Chinese. And Andrew Graham Dixon, English art critic, has said the only comparable event to the total obliteration of English art under the Tudors in the 16th century, of our national heritage, because sculpture, painting, everything went. He said the only comparable event was the Chinese Cultural Revolution in history. So the comparison, the Chinese look back on the same catastrophic blow to their culture that Shakespeare looked back on.
Wow.
So there is a parallel.
Yeah, and you see, and you still have that underground dissident community. You have church officials doing business with the officials to, well, enrich themselves and keep their own estates up. And you still have this beating heart of faith that continues and resists and carries on. Your family was a part of this. Your family was a part of the recusancy in England. They were faithful Catholics.
Yes, on my, not on my husband's side. The Asquiths stuck with the Protestant faith because, like many, many other people, they benefited hugely from it. They inherited, so they had to stay with the status quo. But yes, I discovered that my forebears, perhaps the most interesting one, was one of the historians in the 19th century of this period, John Hungerford Pollen, a priest and scholar, Jesuit, in the late 19th, early 20th century. He was a seminal scholar of the period.
Wow. Well, thank you for carrying on his work. And you know, nothing made me so happy as when I was at the Royal Shakespeare Company, I think in Stratford, and I opened up the playbill, and there was an entire section of dramaturgy, and it was referencing your work in shadow play, which did open up. Apparently, if scholars won't fully accept what you've done, perhaps the most important group has, which are the players themselves.
The actors. Well, Shakespeare would have thought they were the most important group.
Well, I do too. Claire Asquith, thank you for being here.
Thank
you. The book
Raymond.
Shakespeare and the Resistance, the Earl of Southampton, the Essex Rebellion, and the poems that challenged Tudor tyranny by Claire Asquith is available at bookstores everywhere and online. It's a fascinating read, and anyone who loves Shakespeare, you really should dive in. It's a fascinating read. Well, she's been the children's book critic at the Wall Street Journal for 13 years. Tonight, she's here to talk about the power of reading aloud to children and how sharing stories together as a family supercharges learning. Here's my interview with the author of the new book, The Enchanted Hour, The Miraculous Power of Reading Aloud in the Age of Distraction, MEGHAN COX GURDON. Now, I want to start with, how did a foreign correspondent end up reviewing children's books at the Wall Street Journal?
Well, this is one of the curious things about life, right? You never know where you're going to wind up. I think that it started with the birth of my first child, then the birth of my second child, then the birth of my third, fourth, and fifth children. I think by that point I'd had enough of the foreign world, and I was ready to focus on the domestic sphere.
Wow! But in many ways, your columns and what you write about is far broader than the world you covered.
Well, indeed. I mean, there's everything in books, right?
Yeah,
There's absolutely everything.
Now, when did you start reading to your children? And how did this book found its origins in a column you wrote, but it really is rooted in your own life?
It actually dates back to some interesting things. So I would say I started reading to my children the minute, in fact, I brought my first daughter home from the hospital 24 years ago.
Molly.
We lived in Japan at the time, and I didn't know anything about how to raise babies. I didn't grow up with siblings, and I came, as my father will joke, I was an only child from a broken home. So I went into motherhood completely without a template. The one thing I did know was that I was going to read to my children, if I ever had them, because I'd seen a friend who'd had babies earlier, and I saw her putting reading aloud sort of at the center of her family life. And I thought, you know, I want to do that. So we got home from the hospital with this little bundle, and I went straight to a rocking chair and picked up a copy of Grimm's fairy tales and started reading aloud. And maybe 2 or 3 minutes into it, I burst into tears. I felt completely ridiculous because, you know, a baby isn't listening. But from there, I recovered, and that went on. And 24 years later, I'm still reading every night.
Wow. To your children. It's a ritual.
It's a ritual. It's the one non-negotiable part of every evening. Yeah.
We're going to talk about it and how it's impacted your family life. But I want to back up for a moment, because in the book, one of the most fascinating parts of the book, you go to the Cincinnati Children's Reading and Literacy Discovery Center.
Right.
They are doing some incredible research on brain development.
So,
what did you learn?
Right. So what they're doing there is quite extraordinary. They are looking at what happens in children's brains, and this is children, the very crucial ages 3 to 5 generally. They're looking at what happens in the brain at that developing time when children are responding to different kinds of inputs. So what happens in a child's brain when he or she is shown a video? What happens in the child's brain when they just listen to a story being told to them without seeing any pictures? And crucially, what happens in a child's brain when that child is, approximate the picture book experience. So the child is looking at still pictures, listening to a story being read. What they discovered, so they've come up with a wonderful sort of fairy tale name for what they discovered, is that they call it the Goldilocks effect. So a story told to a small child without any accompanying pictures is a little too cold, like the first bowl of porridge that Goldilocks tastes. It's not enough going on in the brain really to get things going.
To engage it.
Right. Showing a child a video is too hot. There's just too much visually going on. There's no time for the deeper brain networks to sort of interact and synchronize with one another. There's no time to reflect on what you're seeing or to jog memories. It's all just bam, bam, bam.
It's a passive viewing experience.
Right.
They can't fully engage.
Right. So the brain it shows that some shock and awe of the visual is happening, but the deeper brain networks that are so important with young children that they engage are not brought to bear. But like the third bowl of porridge that Goldilocks tastes when she goes into the Three Bears house, the picture book experience is just right. It gives small children exactly what they need to develop their brain architecture.
That is amazing.
And there's so much more that goes on, and that's one of the wonderful things I discovered in the research for the book. It isn't just that there's a lot of cognitive stimulation, again, stipulating that we're talking about younger children here. But there's an immense amount of emotional kind of education that takes place when we read to kids. There's a huge physiological reward for both parent and child.
A bonding.
Yeah, I mean, in a literal way. The stress hormones decrease and bonding hormones increase in the bodies of both parent and child in that environment.
Wow.
So you're doing something that is, you know, transcendent. It's really an extraordinary thing to do with a child. But may I say, in the book, I do talk mostly about children and reading with children and reading in the family context.
But you talk about your children in their teenage years and what happens later as well.
And indeed. And of course, as I say, you know, we sometimes forget that the parent-child relationship is not the only important family dynamic. And there is also the child-parent relationship. And in this respect, we can read to our elders. And it's incredibly good for them. It's good for us. It's a beautiful way to bond.
Yeah, well, you're exploring ideas, worlds together. You're feeling your way through things. But that proximity, I loved that you talked about, and the science backing up what we sort of already know. But it's amazing how you've laid out the scientific breakthroughs. Now, so many kids are spending time on these things.
Right.
9 hours a day, 10 hours a day on devices. What does this do to counteract this? I mean, your subtitle is The Miraculous Power of Reading Aloud in the Age of Distraction.
Quite, yeah. Well, one of the extraordinary things is that reading aloud is almost like it's like a broad spectrum antibiotic, or you can choose your metaphor. You know, it's an antidote. It's an antitoxin. The things that we get from time we spend reading together are almost exactly those things that we lose through the heavy use of technology. So, for instance, I mean, you probably have this experience. Many of us do. When your phone is around, you're not really fully present all the time with the people you love. You can be in a room with your own family, and you're kind of half your mind is on the phone or something you just saw. One of the beautiful things about turning off the phone, putting it away, picking up a book, and reading with someone is that you are fully present with them. And this is something very important for children in particular. They really need it. They need to see our faces. They need us to talk to them. They need to feel that we are speaking to them and seeing them.
Yeah, I was shocked because I've narrated my audiobooks. My kids listen to audiobooks. Reluctant readers, I know, I've suggested give them the book and let them listen to the audiobook as a lure to keep them reading.
Right.
But it doesn't have the same effect as a live person reading.
Right.
Why not?
Right. Well, you know, think of it in this way. If you listen to live music, you watch a live ballet performance on stage, or any kind of performance on stage, or theater piece, something. It's a work of art that takes place in the moment and then it's gone. And there's something about that fugitive moment that is special.
Well, the interaction. The performer is reacting to the audience and vice versa.
And there's energy moving around, right? And that's the same sort of thing. Now, I love audiobooks. I too recorded my audiobooks.
Oh, good.
So if you like the sound of my voice now, you can listen to it again on your commute.
Enchanted Hour in audio.
Yeah. But at the same time, you know, it doesn't have that live element, obviously. And one of the things that, again, with children is very important is they don't always understand everything that they're hearing. They may miss which character is saying what in an exchange of dialogue. You know, an audiobook doesn't know if a child has misunderstood something or doesn't understand a word, whereas a human reader with the child perceives the moment of confusion, right? Can pause and stop or say, you know, what do you think about that?
Right.
You know, again, it's a live, much more human experience.
Time spent. You're exploring the world together.
Oh,
It's really what it is.
Sure. A multiplicity of worlds. I mean, as we know, right? Stories are portals into wonders. And how great it is to share that experience with people you love.
I want to talk about the ebook phenomenon, which polling has showed, certainly in the children's realm, children prefer hard books to ebooks. Why? And why is one more advantageous to them than the other, or better for them than the other?
So as to the ebook itself as a way of receiving literature, I don't know the answer to that. I will tell you, though, that one of the difficulties and one of the reasons that I've been, you know, various people I spoke to advised me to stick to the idea that, you know, you turn off the technology in order to really participate in the text. One of the reasons is that when you're reading on a device, you know that the whole wonder world of the internet is just a button press away. You know it if you're reading, let's say you're reading a book to your child from an iPad. You know, yes, there is the text of the book. Yes, you can, as it were, turn the pages. But both of you know that everything is underneath that surface, and therefore it takes you out of the moment.
And sometimes there are hyperlinks in the text.
Right.
You can click on them, and that tells you about the palace described or the locale described, and that does take you out of the experience. Video is the same. Video storybooks are not as
Well, look, I mean, these are all
effective.
different ways of enjoying stories, right? I mean, and also the technology genie
but the
is
science,
out of the box.
but your book indicates the science shows us that it's not having the same impact.
Oh, for sure.
As the verbal.
Oh no, that's
delivery
absolutely right. The
being.
live human experience is by far the best. It's just the best.
Well, what's the earliest age to start reading to children? You talk about infants in this book.
I would say you start reading to children before they're born. Here's why. Here's why. Because when you start reading aloud, for some people who are not natural performers or hams, depending on how you
Don't look at me that way when you say that, Megan.
It may be a little awkward, you know, the first time you start to read aloud, especially you haven't done it very much before. So one of the great things is you start before the baby's even born. The baby can hear your voice, right? The baby knows who's talking, mother or father, the baby can hear it. And we know from looking at the brains of babies when they are newborn, they recognize the voices of their parents, particularly their mothers. Their brains light up, as it were. A term, by the way, that neurologists say we shouldn't use. It's not accurate, but as a layman, I'm going to use it. No, start as soon as you can. I mean, absolutely start as soon as you can.
Tell me what, in the book you talk about the parent-child relationship and how this time spent reading together, it can pay dividends into the teenage years and beyond.
Yeah,
Tell me your experience and what does science tell us?
Yeah, so what we know, of course, is that people who read together with their children and develop their relationships, they have that sort of emotional fortification. It makes them more emotionally acute as they get older. They become better friends. You know, their life is easier when you get along with people. And a lot of strong social emotional development takes place during that reading aloud. Here's where it helps for children. If you have, and this is what we've done in my family, we're no paragons, but in this respect, I think, you know, I'm prepared to stand by it. You institutionalize a time every day when you read together, right? It might be bedtime, it might be over breakfast, whatever it is. You pick a time, you stick with it, and then as the years go by, you already have an appointment with your own family or with your own children every day, right? So they get older, maybe there's less to talk about. In the case of my son, I have 4 daughters, 1 son. When he was 13, 14, 15, you know, we didn't have a lot in common in those years. Our conversations were not necessarily very rewarding for either of us, consisting mostly of me saying, you know, how was your day? And him saying, what's for dinner?
Yeah.
But we always had this evening date to read together. And it was like the books became a kind of bridge over the turbulent waters of adolescence. It was a place that we could meet in books and just be together, having that physiological reward of being next to each other without there having to be difficult conversation. And by that, I don't mean that I was trying to avoid a difficult conversation, but just that conversation that sometimes in life, it's difficult.
Yeah. Megan, one of the reasons that I started really into this whole area of writing for children, literacy initiative, when you look at these 4th grade reading proficiency levels, which in the book you talk about 64%, that number has barely moved. It is static. Why are we having a literacy crisis in the United States, which is what it is? And my contention is if you aren't reading at proficiency level in 4th grade, you're not going to be a great citizen. You don't know anything about your history, and it makes you making that person a moral person is much more difficult because they don't reflect on things. They're not trained to take information in and reflect on it, just as a human being.
Right. There are these moments in life, you know, there's certain determinative moments, it seems like. The age of 4, whether a child can pay attention at the age of 4, which is another thing that reading with them really helps. It inculcates a nice long attention span, very important. A child of 4 who can focus, that correlates with math and science and literacy achievement at age 21 and predicts whether children will graduate from university by 25, right? So that's one. You're absolutely right. Then there's the question, if you can't read at the age of, in 4th grade, you probably weren't reading in 3rd grade and probably not in 2nd grade. And that manifests itself not just as a literacy crisis or a citizenship crisis, as you describe, but also has ramifications for math achievement. Because when you get to theoretical math, it's too late, right? There's a very strong linkage between math and reading in the early years.
Wow. Yeah. I want to read something from the book. And you quote Maria Tartar, and she wrote a book called Enchanted Hunters. Yes. And I loved this quote: "Literature for children enthralls and entrances in large part through the shock effects of beauty and horror. We all like to be shocked and startled, and there's something about amplification and exaggeration that you always get in these stories. And then you always get riddles and enigmas. You're shocked and startled and curious. How did this thing happen? What if something like this happened? So immediately all your senses are engaged. You know, this children's literature area, it's a mixed bag. Adults, I find adults are more shocked and worried about the content than the kids are. I almost think you need the shock to shake them. Flannery O'Connor always talked about, you know, you need that kind of gothic sledgehammer to wake everybody up. I think given all the competition for children's eyes and attention, you need that to wake them up. What are you seeing as you review books? Are we feeding that enchantment, that wonder, that horror and beauty that Tartar talks about?
Yeah, it's something I look for. I absolutely look for books that have a kind of, not necessarily beauty in a kind of namby-pamby or saccharine way, right? It's beauty with force. Sometimes beauty can come in unexpected clothing. What am I seeing? I see a lot of books that I would quickly pass over, to be perfectly honest with you. I feel that we are missing, sometimes we're missing a sense of adventure. There's a great interest amongst adults in perpetuating certain very important standard issue ideas, right? And so, I mean, there are 1,000 picture books, for instance, about, you know, someone who feels like the odd person out, and the other playmates, whether they're giraffes or whatever, you know, isolate that person, and everyone gets the lesson. No, you know, it's okay to be unusual, and everybody needs to accept you.
Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer.
Right, yeah. But I mean, it's that idea is done to death, and the presumption somehow is that children are these savages who wouldn't otherwise have, know how to
wouldn't know
treat
the
kind of striped giraffe in their midst. No, actually, but anyway, no. So I mean, I do think it's one of the reasons I love to look at collections of folk tales and fairy tales when they come through. Sometimes they're retellings, sometimes they're, collections of fairy tales and stories that have been neglected by historians and folk tale collectors over the years. Is that there is this depth to them, right? Yeah. There's depth, because the stories to last have to be told over and over and over again. They have to be worth telling over and over and over again. And there is a kind of clarification that takes place over time. Extraneous characters get left out, and what you have at the nugget is something deep and human, right? And so even the retellings of fairy tales can keep that, if the authors are not too busy trying to sell some sort of contemporary correctness, shall we say?
No, that you feel. I read all the Grimm's fairy tales to my kids, and there is something. I remember my mother reading to me. There are certain books that you just connect with. I mean, every time I see Peter Pan, I instantly think of my mother, because I hear her voice.
Right.
And that those themes of what resonated with parents, and that's what I love about your book, The Enchanted Hour. It really is about not only sharing your values and your ideas with your children, but really your soul with them in some ways.
Absolutely.
And only literature, that shared experience, can impart that outside of a religious experience.
Right. Of course, there are other ways up the mountain, as it were. But no, I think that's exactly right. I think, and in fact, as in terms of connectedness, the connectedness is not just, parent and child having an emotional connection. It's connectedness to culture. It's connectedness to literature, to the stories that your parents, grandparents, maybe great-grandparents knew and loved. There's beauty in that, right? And also there's, there are artistic traditions that children can encounter through picture books that they might not ever get anywhere else, at least not until they're adults or in college, if they're lucky enough to go to college.
There's another quote. I have to share this before we run out of time. Anna Dewdney.
Dewdney, yeah.
Whom you quote at the very end of your book. Yeah. And she says, when we read to a child, we are doing so much more than teaching him to read or instilling in her a love of language. We are doing something that I believe is just as powerful, and it is something that we are losing as a culture. By reading with a child, we are teaching that child to be human.
It's so beautiful. Yeah. She said it perfectly. It's absolutely right.
And this book teaches us all to be human. It's really The Enchanted Hour, The Miraculous Power of Reading Aloud in the Age of Distraction by MEGHAN COX GURDON, available at bookstores everywhere. Such a great book. Thank you for the time.
Thank you so much for having me.
And MEGHAN's reviews of children's books, maybe the best out there. You should read her in the Wall Street Journal each week. Just fantastic insight. There's a depth to the review that I always find challenging and enlightening. So thank you for being here again.
Thank you so much.
And now let's get story-oriented. He's the New York Times best-selling author of The Book Thief, which recently was named the 14th favorite novel by PBS viewers in the Great American Read. I sat down with him recently here in Washington to talk about storytelling and his latest epic novel, only 13 years in the making, Bridge of Clay. Here's my exclusive interview with Markus Zusak. So Markus, tell me, Bridge of Clay, 13 years to write this book. Why did it take so long this time?
Well, I say this with a smile on my face, but there was a fair bit of failure right from the beginning. And I think for a long time, I'd always thought of this book as being my best idea. I thought of it when I was 20 years old, which is more than 2 decades ago. And I think when you think of something as your best idea, you've already put pressure on yourself. And so I think I just got a bit over-focused on making every single thing perfect as I was writing it.
Yeah.
And I think you can easily lose sight of the fact that it only has to be the best it can be when it's going to the printer.
Right.
And you just have to just get your hands dirty and hope for the best for a long time as well.
What was it about this story that made it so elusive? I mean, we all have our kind of pet ideas that you're almost afraid to approach because they occupy such a piece of your heart in some ways. What was it about this one that made it so hard to get on paper?
I think it was pretty much everything. I mean, firstly, the idea, it's about a character who wants to make something perfect. Then I decided he could have a brother and a sister. That was in the original incarnation of the story was 20 years ago, and I thought, well, that didn't work. And I ended up with 5 brothers in a family, and then I wanted to go into the backstory of their parents as well. And so I just thought, because who we are actually starts long before we're born. And so I wanted to write a character who's building his whole life into this bridge he's building. And I love the idea that novels are complete worlds. And so it's a matter of figuring out how many countries you want to have on the map. And I think maybe I put a lot of work into the planning, and sometimes you just don't know quite when to stop. But it was, my favourite moments talking about this book were when people would say to me, if you're having so much trouble with this book, just write one of your other ideas. And I'd say, I haven't got any other ideas.
This is it.
This is it. But now I realise I did have other ideas, but they were all going into this book. It was very much a sense of all or nothing. For a long time, it was nothing.
Yeah. Well, this is about Clay Dunbar, who wants to build a bridge over a river before it floods. And I don't want to give away too much more because it would reveal too much. That's not really what the book is about. That's on the surface what the book is about.
Yeah.
What would you tell people you discovered in the telling of this story that they need to hear today?
I think it was just if I'm asked the question, and it's always, as you know, the toughest question, what's your book about?
What is it about?
You stumble and you trip over, and and then finally you walk away, and then you go, oh, I should have said this.
Right.
But I think it's about a family, really,
Right.
and it's about one moment that decimates that family, and one boy in the family that takes it upon himself to bring them all back together. And I don't think he realises he's doing that. He's really wanting to build a bridge to make something great and beautiful and perfect, to atone for what he feels are his sins. And what he doesn't know is that that's the way he's going to get his brothers and their father back together. But he's really just wanting to mould his life into this bridge, and it's made of stone, but it's made of him, it's made of clay. And that was what drew me to the story in the first place, was the idea that clay as a material can be moulded into anything, but it needs fire to set it. And once I had that idea for the book, I knew that it was something that I was going to try to get right for what looks like, a good portion of my own life.
A chunk of your adult life.
Yeah.
Originally, there was a girl narrator, Maggie. You discarded that and ended up with one of the brothers, Matthew being the narrator of the book, who is the narrator now. Why that change? What happened in the old telling that you didn't like?
Well, it just wasn't working. And I could recite the first 50 pages of that book, you know, without even thinking. I'd be walking down the street, mumbling her narration to myself, but it just never quite, I never felt quite comfortable with it. And I think, you know, when you're working so hard and so hard and you think, but it just didn't feel right. And then after 6 years, I had to make that dreaded decision. And you're always being tested as a writer, I think. You're always being tested with the question of how much do I want this? Right. How hungry am I to get this story written? And I think when you're faced with a dilemma like that, I tried everybody. I tried Matthew as the narrator. I tried every brother. I tried even their mother.
That's what I was going to ask you. Did you try the mother as a narrator?
I did, but then, you know, not to give a spoiler, it said right at the beginning that there's this, one of the lines is their mother was dead, their father had fled.
Right.
And but then I thought, in my previous book, The Book Thief, I had death as the narrator. Right. I thought if I have a dead character as the narrator, I thought, I don't want to just be the death guy all the time. So, yeah, that's definitely sounding a bit grim. So it ended up being Matthew as Clay's brother when I just started believing it. And that's what made me want to be a writer in the first place, was, you know, you're reading something that someone has entirely made up, but when you're in it, you believe it. And when Matthew started telling the story about digging up an old typewriter in an old backyard of a town, I thought, oh, now I'm feeling alive again. And I think you would recognise this too, that I'm just happiest when I'm writing and I'm writing well. And when you're getting those little sparks of ideas that say, you know, this is when I'm at my best.
Well, you're telling yourself the story. There's an excitement as the story is coming to you. And so you can imagine, well, it's an experience you're passing along to the reader. But unless you're touched and excited, you can feel that in the narrative, if it's working or not. I mean, you really do.
Yeah, and so that's exactly how it felt. I mean, it's not that there aren't struggles then. No. I still got to, you know, a point in 2016 where my wife said to me, and she's really the unsung hero of this book, where she said to me, it was one of those great moments of tough love. She said, I'm giving you 1 week to get this book back on track at a point where you're actually happy with it again. And she said, other than that, you and Clay
have to separate.
The character needs some, she said, I think you two need some time apart. And which is better than her saying that she and I need some time apart.
Right, exactly.
And so I worked for a week, nothing changed. And and I did quit the book for 6 weeks. She said the most dreaded thing that you could say to me. She said, why don't you work on your blog for a while? And the point is, no one in the world knows that I would even have a blog.
Knife in the heart.
I'm not good at that sort of stuff. And I tried to write a small side project. And I thought, for that, I was sort of empty, because I just said to myself at one point, God, before you were writing for the World Championship of yourself, when you were writing Bridge of Clay, and now you're doing this. And so I think sometimes the old cliche is true, that we don't know what we've got until we lose it.
That's true.
And when I started again, I just went in with the idea that, yeah, it's a struggle to write a book, but it's actually a joyful struggle. And when I went in with that approach, I just started really loving it again. And 6 months later, I finished the book. And I also had been beating myself up for so long that it wasn't done, I was really, and then I realised how much work I'd actually done on the book. I just needed to finish it.
Right.
Just the last quarter to go.
Well, it is a complex book. You have chronologies, you have a lot of flashbacks and multiple character narratives. How did you keep track of all that? Or did that just come in the constant work over many years?
Well, I think every single thing in that book, whether people love it, don't love it, and you know, it's all deliberate. Everything is there for a reason. Every word is there for a reason, and so when I'm willing to wear that if people say, "Oh, I got confused here," but I've always said to myself that every time I write a book, I want it to be a better book than the last one, and or at least it's got to be a great attempt, and it's all in the attempt. And in this case, I've sort of said to people, there are different challenges in this book to my previous books, but I think the rewards are greater. And I know they have been for me in the writing of it. And I think as a writer, sometimes you have to just remember that.
Yeah.
You know, the next time you're beating yourself up about, it's a bit like it's no different to surfing in some ways. Whenever I'm at home, I go for a surf, and I'm always thinking, why am I always the worst surfer out here? And that's how I feel about writing. I'm like, why am I always the worst writer here? And then you have to remind yourself, it's because I'm trying to do something. I'm always trying to write above myself. I'm trying to write better than I actually am. And that's the sort of writer I want to be, and I think it's the sort of person I want to be too.
The last book, The Book Thief, mined your parents' experiences in World War II. What was the root, the personal connection to this story, to Clay's story?
I think I was just always kind of ambitious as a kid, and I think that's because I'm the youngest of 4 siblings, and so I grew up with everybody saying, no, you can't play Monopoly, you're too young. No, you can't play cards, you're too young. Which sounds almost petty, and maybe it is. But I was always a kid who, and this is really what it is. It wasn't so much a sense of one day I'm going to show everybody. It was more just what I love is stories, whether they're written or whether they're told to me. And so I was spoilt as the youngest of 4 kids, not by getting material things. I was spoilt by the fact that I got to spend the most meaningful amount of time, for the longest amount of time, with my mum and dad. And they told me their stories when I was a teenager, and I would ask for them over and over again. And so the root of this book, or the heart of this book, I think is just how much I've always loved stories. And Clay is that sort of kid as well. He's the one who asks his mum and dad for the stories about, you know, when his dad did bury his dog and the snake who fought each other in his old backyard in that country town, and then how he buried his mum's typewriter in the backyard as well. And it's that very typewriter that Matthew goes out and digs up to write the story on. So I just love the idea that one story isn't just a story. No. It's the story that came before it and after it, between it and underneath it. And that's what this book is doing all the time.
Well, I loved a couple of things, and you've touched upon them. It's a sweeping family saga, really, of memory, of secrets and stories, and how the decisions of all those around us shape our own journey. We're not alone. And you know, this is such a powerful theme for me and in my work, because look, I have a middle grade series that contains a whole family. The kid doesn't go on the adventure alone. It's the complications of the family around him and the powers of that family that propel him or hold him back. And that's similar to what we find here, because this is life. And I loved that dimension of the work, that it's not afraid to go to those places, and it takes you to some of those unexpected, there's some memories you never want to see again or hear about, and yet they end up being the most important for not only the character but the reader in this case.
Yeah, there's a moment in the book that you may have come to where Penelope, Clay's mum, is actually telling him what he calls the unedited versions, because there's this idea that when we tell truths, we tell them as almost everything. There's always something we leave out. And towards the end of her life, she tells him the almost everythings. And then she says, you know, you've got to ask your dad. Tell him, please, you know, tell him about how you used to be able to draw and paint. And did you know he once buried a typewriter in his backyard? And she says, these stories aren't just stories, they're who we actually are. And that's why I'm a writer. That's why I love books, and that's why I'll always be writing. Whether you know, even if a ray of light came out of the sky and said, "You'll never write another book. You'll never be published. You'll never get anything for it," I would still be doing it, because it's what keeps me alive.
What are you working on now?
Absolutely nothing.
Aside from promoting Bridge of Clay.
I've come out the other side of this book, which has been a struggle at times, really loving writing more than I ever have. And so for that reason, I'm just going to write for a while and see what happens. But I've got a few different ideas, but I'm not sure which way I want to go with them yet. And there are a lot of characters in this book that could have been novels of their own, and whether I explore that, I'm not sure, but we'll just see how we go.
Bridge of Clay, the latest novel by Markus Zusak, is available in stores everywhere and online. And of course, Will Wilder 3, The Amulet of Power, and the rest of the Will Wilder series is available at bookstores as well. I hope you get it. Makes a great spring gift and fun summer reading to read aloud, as Megan said. That is all the time we have for now. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. You can like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter. The links are at raymondarroyo.com. Be sure to catch us next week. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. Bye now.